Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to Beyond the Metaverse, the evolution of reality. My name is Kilma Lattin. I'm the founder and CEO of Our Worlds, and thank you for joining us. I'll be the moderator today. Every generation challenges the depiction of reality that came before, from religious iconography to the Renaissance and the discovery of perspective to photography and photo filters. Each generation redefines beauty and its vision for the future. In this age of emerging XR technologies, we will also be remembered for how we choose to depict our own realities. What does this mean for creators and developers who are working with emerging technologies? Here's how it unfolded for me. I evolved the reality of my civilization starting in 2014 when I began putting code to culture, and it all started with the digitalization of our ancient tribal hand game known as Peon. Until my handheld mobile experience, Peon had traditionally been played only in person by our people since time immemorial. In 2015, I wrote an article called Paradigm Shift that called Native Americans to exercise their sovereign right of digital self-determination and use virtual and augmented realities to preserve and advance their culture through gaming. The resistance was fierce. How dare I try to change our reality? So I sought counsel of tribal elders and quickly learned that the elders supported me. They understood that civilizations and cultures must evolve for survival. You can't move forward very well if you're looking backwards. So at our company, Our Worlds, our mission statement is to harvest the power of emerging technologies, geolocation, in order to more comprehensively capture, preserve, and share culture. Our Worlds is advancing the narrative beyond the metaverse because we're pioneering a communal approach to world building and invoking an ancient belief system that education and knowledge is experiential and can be found in nature. Our model empowers stakeholders to build their own digital future with place-based experiences. Today, we're joined by three highly talented individuals whose work is well underway. They aren't waiting for the future, they're engineering the future now and already creating digital legacies. This panelist is a traveler through liminal space and is involved in the digital capture and virtualization of cultural sites around the world and a myriad ways in which we engage with them. He envisions extended realities that offer insight into traditional and timeless systems of knowledge and wisdom, challenging us to reimagine our interrelationships with others and with the planet that sustains us all. He's an archaeologist and scientist with the Qualcomm Institute at the University of California, San Diego, where he co-leads the Cultural Heritage Engineering Initiative. He's actively involved in the development of digital workflows for documentation, virtualization, immersive visualization of multimodal data and cultural heritage sites around the world. Please welcome Dominique Rosolo.
Thank you.
An award-winning developer, filmmaker with projects spanning mobile and extended reality, film, software, and scientific applications, data visualization. Her apps have been featured in Apple's top 10 with over 3 million cumulative downloads. She's the CTO and co-founder of Our Worlds and holds a BFA from the Cooper Union School of Art. She was on a full tuition scholarship as a film and fine arts major. She's worked in the music video industry until discovering digital media and has since designed and developed flagship products for a variety of businesses and verticals aside from education, entertainment, including fashion, health, medicine, telecom. She won the Rico Theta Prize with 3 teammates at the Reality Virtually Hackathon at MIT in October in 2017 for a virtual reality project that assisted first responders. Please welcome Catherine Ng. And last but certainly not least, a woman of the Madawaska River Algonquin people belonging to the Crane Clan and mixed settler heritage. She's the owner and executive consultant of Wasaya Consulting and Wasaya Cultural Tours, 2 small businesses dedicated to reviving and celebrating indigenous ancestral knowledge and culture based on practices through educational opportunity. She's the co-owner of Algonquin Motors, which is a motorcycle clothing company based in the unceded Algonquin territory. In addition to her own company, she's the executive director of Native Lands Digital, which is an indigenous-led, not-for-profit dedicated to providing education about indigenous peoples, territories, knowledge, and systems across the world. She's currently studying for a Master of Arts in Indigenous Studies at Trent University. Christina Luckasavitch. So, The format is going to be, I'll have our panelists just in their own words introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about the exciting work that they're doing in the space. We'll hit a couple of discussion points, and then we'll do some pointed questions for them individually and let the conversation evolve from there. Dominique, let's start with you. Thanks for making the journey. Introduce yourself to the crowd in your own words and tell us a little bit about the incredible work you're doing.
Yeah, pleasure to be here, Kilma. Thank you, and to join all of you here today. Again, my name is Dominique Rosolo, and there are many archaeologists involved in the digital documentation and virtualization of heritage places. We're also interested in creating immersive room-scale environments that spur analytical reasoning through interactive visualization. So the idea is to be able to bring stakeholders together, to bring domain experts together into places where we can virtually access place-based memory and the kinds of phenomena that we document in the real world, to have a conversation, to deliberate, to argue, to enjoy each other's company within our data. And so we're also interested in expanding into multisensory approaches that can not only spur that analytical reasoning, but can also help recall memory. And this could be a temperature, sound, even scent, and that sort of thing. So we really want to be able to bring people together, but through XR in ways that are maybe non-traditional.
Okay, thank you. Christine, it's an honor to have you all the way down from Canada. Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work.
Kwe ani bojo Christine Dishnakas Madawaska Zibin Donjiva Ajijak Dodem Mama Winanish Nabe Kwendao. My name is Christine. I am from the Crane clan, Madawaskarini, Algonquin person, also of mixed settler heritage. Wanting to acknowledge that we are on indigenous territory here, so just wanting to put it out there to each of you. Do you know whose land you're on when you're here? Can you understand that underneath the concrete, the pavement, the buildings that are here, you are still on indigenous territory? And I do encourage you to download, particularly the Our Worlds beta, to see whose land that you're on. So as Kilma had mentioned, I am the executive director of Native Land Digital, which is a Canadian nonprofit organization that started in 2014 with a non-Indigenous person who wanted to create a space where people can learn about the deeper history of the places that they're on. And so over the course of a number of years, that has evolved into a global map of Indigenous territories, languages, and treaties, completely led by an Indigenous staff, as well as governed by an Indigenous board of directors and an advisory council and an elders council too. And so really, to sum up the work that I do, it is providing space for Indigenous peoples to share stories, because for so long, our stories have not been as prevalent as they need to be. And so in any way possible, both through my work with Native Land Digital and through some of my own work, as well as through my academic career, if there is a way that I can allow space for people to tell their stories, particularly Indigenous stories, so that we can understand that much deeper history, that it didn't just start 450 years ago, that's what I'm going to do. So Chimigwech, thank you, Kilma, and thank you, Catherine, and everyone for being here. Chimigwech.
Wonderful. Okay, Catherine, please introduce yourself and tell everyone about the important work you're doing over at Our Worlds.
Of course. So in 2017, I began my journey into augmented reality and virtual reality. I was able to meet Kilma Lattin and his son at one of the STEM coding camps. So in addition to being a designer and developer, I am extremely interested. I have children, so I would like to pay it forward. I am a designer and artist by training, but then have picked up the tools to learn how to code and create applications and software and websites along the way. And I figured if I could do it, anybody could do it. So, I know that certainly as a designer, my goal for developing is really just to realize the visions that I see. And I understand that a lot of what drives children to create is also along those same lines. Really they want to be masters of their own domain, and they want to draw what they have around you. I mean, you ask any child what is who's the best artist in your class, and they'll know who's the fastest runner, who's the best artist. And so these are ways that from a very young age you can begin to sort of create agency over your environment. And that aspect of what art is and what it has been over the centuries and what it is now in augmented reality are extremely important to me. So really my work with Our Worlds, when I met Kilma Lattin and his interest in advancing his culture forward with technology, I was extremely fascinated, because certainly one of the things we like to say at Our Worlds is we're really pairing America's oldest civilization with its newest technologies. And that, to me, is quite fascinating, and that's the basis of our practice together.
Wonderful, wonderfully said. Okay, so that's kind of like the end of the formal portion. We had to get all that out of the way. But now let's kind of dig into the meat and potatoes of this. Beyond the metaverse, right, this top-down approach of like we're building a world and you guys can all find your way in it, doesn't sit well with some other creators who are thinking that maybe there's another way, another model that's maybe a little more communal-based. Maybe there's new ways to imagine how we can merge these technologies with civilizations. And so jumping into the discussion now that we've gone past the formal part, just right out of the gate, all three of you, all four of us, all of our work is tied to location, okay? All of our work is tied to location. Why? What is so important about place, and how did each of you arrive at the conclusion that technology should be paired with location or one's place? Is this the best use case for new technologies, and if so, why? So that's a question to the panel.
Go ahead if you want, Christine.
So for me, I belong to a nation that has been continuously fractured due to colonization and settlement, as well as forcible displacement of people, including my family. And for me growing up, I did not necessarily know who I am as an Algonquin person. And from that, I started to spend time on the land. I started to spend time in the places that my family has been for at least 11,000 years, or really since time immemorial. And with that, I started to understand that there's a connection that is inherent. There is a connection that exists physically, spiritually, and so on. And we should be able to celebrate that. We should be able to know who we are and the places that we are connected to. And so through my professional career, I haven't necessarily had a direct intention of where I'm going to go, but rather have landed in places that have gifted me with incredible experiences and allowed me to meet some incredible folks. And with Native Land, when I first started, I had actually used it as an educator in a previous professional role, and starting on as the executive director, and seeing sort of the back way of the way that the organization works, and really what goes into making sure that we're counter mapping. We are erasing colonial lines and boundaries and so on that we are so used to seeing when we look at maps of the world. And so what happens when you erase those colonial lines and those ways of understandings that we've been so trained to look at and understand, but instead we prioritize Indigenous language, Indigenous territory, Indigenous understandings of land, and really provide a space for those stories to come to life. So then in what ways can we really provide a space where we can show a map that shows land, but then put the stories there and pair them together?
Wonderful. Dominique?
Well, it's interesting. Memory has both a spatial and temporal component, and the spatial is very important. And as Christine mentioned, that our identities are crafted around where we reside, where we live, where we've collected those memories throughout our lives, and also our identity is very much tied to the land where our ancestors walked, and where they made their memories and shared them with us through time. And so place is elemental, it's essential, and it's very important to be able to capture that. And we're doing that through the technologies that we're all very familiar with. I'm also very interested in how knowledge bearers can contribute place-based memory in ways that are not entirely reliant on technology, but can make their way into the kinds of XR experiences that allow us to more broadly share these stories. And so, we can imagine in a way that these place-based memories could come into this environment from those individuals who are maybe disinterested in technology. Maybe people want to contribute recipes, they want to contribute song, prayer, poems, that don't necessarily have to be, involve people coding or have people, in VR creating those experiences. So, it's a fascinating thing, how rich memory is and how it can be very much attached to place.
Catherine.
Yeah, I mean, both of what you said are very much in line with what my thoughts about this topic are and what we're doing at Our World. So certainly, yes, place-based locations, this is the basis of our identities. And what is really interesting is that you can learn a great deal on YouTube and reading, and there's certainly many modes of knowledge acquisition. And I think that the more we train ourselves to read and to sort of parse the news and all of these things, these facts and these visions reside someplace in our minds. And we can recall them, which is a miracle, at a moment's notice, at a cocktail party or in conversation. It's just a stream. But how different would it be if the reality of where you live also intersected with some of this knowledge? And certainly that's the way knowledge, or rather language acquisition happens. Little kids hear the same words over and over and over again. We sort of speak very slowly to children. We tend to say the same words to them over and over. And certainly, if we begin to think about how knowledge acquisition at that level, begins to transform and grow into a broader knowledge base, that's what we're doing with our place-based stories. Anywhere you go in the world, we are able to pin whether it's, like as you said, a poem or a song or really photographs, 3D, 360, augmented reality visages, whether or not they're long form or short form. These will persist. Through our application, we find it incredibly powerful that we are able to pin within a geolocation or a geofence these places really for perpetuity. And there's power to that. We can see side-by-side history and the present day, there at our beck and call. At the moment of inquiry, it's always there. If we have a question about it again, we can go back to it and look at it again. And that kind of reinforcement, I think, is very interesting, and we're just sort of at the starting point of that and seeing where that might take us as a group of people who are acquiring knowledge, as their lives go on.
So that's fascinating. And what implication does that model have on this thing called, in my opinion, this dystopian concept of the metaverse, where I'm in my house, in my underwear or something, and I'm wearing these goggles, and it's like, okay, did I make it out of the house today? I don't know, but here, where am I? So what implications does getting outside, experiencing place, getting this experiential knowledge in nature and connecting with the world around you through extended realities, what implication does that have when you put it contrastually against this concept that we're all hearing about, the metaverse?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah, kind of. It's just because we have to start to look at all these things
certainly
side by side to decide, for us what works, because there's dueling models right now. There's there's this fully immersive reality, and then there's people who are saying, well, wait, let's go out into nature with our stuff. And personally, for me, I can't wait for the glasses so I can wear something so I can go out in nature and have the best of both worlds. But what about these dueling realities that we're all debating now?
Yeah, what's really fascinating about let's just say some of the metaverse projects that we see out there, certainly some of the corporate metaverse projects that we see out there, is that they're approaching this as kind of a design problem, which is interesting. Of course, I'm a designer, and I've worked on contracts, and there's a goal, a design goal, and an outcome that's desired. And certainly you could approach the metaverse that way. If it was a giant project and someone was paying you a lot of money, it's like, how would you do it? Like, give it your best shot. I'm sure we could come up with something great. But how did the world happen? How did the reality that we're living in now happen? It certainly wasn't a design problem assigned to a couple of elite designers. We all created it. And our ancestors and generations back and back, like we all had contributions, big and small. And that is the way, if we want to call it the metaverse, I tend to shy away from that term altogether. I like to call it immersive realities, because these are places that, we're living in an immersive reality right now. This is real life, but it's immersive and it's a reality. So, whatever shape that takes, I think we should all have a voice in it. And that's
wonderfully stated.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting sort of thing. For us, I think what we're talking about here is a metaverse where we don't escape and spend, but rather engage and learn. And there's an opportunity here, at least for us, working with tribal communities, to use this as a means by which we can bring knowledge bearers into the conversation and start to bring some of that knowledge about the natural environment and traditional ways of being in the world and seeing the world, into that sort of separate reality in a way. And I'd like to think of, when we think about the sort of metaverse, I see that in a way that it doesn't have to be much different than a saunter through the woods with someone who has a story to share, or a way of gathering around a fire and listening to songs and maybe you don't have the wood smoke in your nose or the warmth on your face or the chill on your back, but it's not a way to step away from nature, but a way to add a different layer to that experience in the natural world.
Let's talk about responsibility. Responsibility in world building and how we're going to create our digital future and our digital legacies. What do I have here? I've got the question here somewhere. Do we bear any responsibility in the way that we create our digital future and the way we apply new technologies, immersive realities? If we're creators and we're designing, what responsibilities do we have on ourselves? What processes, what considerations should we take, or do you take in your work? How do you hold yourself to a standard if we're pioneering and there's no laws that tell us or govern us so much on what to do, or very few laws? What sort of processes or regulations do we take, or do you take in your work, so that you're putting forth some responsibility to what you do?
So as we had mentioned, the topic of land and really around territory and claiming territory and who's been here and who has been here and no longer here and so on, it can get rather complicated, particularly when you're mapping and when you're counter mapping and when you have vague territories that overlap and so on. But the way that we approach mapping and is that it's entirely community-based. We have a starting point, and then we adapt as needed. So for us, the ethical considerations are always first, what are the needs of community? What is community telling us? So ultimately, any data, any information that goes into the information that we have on our map, which is global, it is primarily from indigenous sources, and then it also is changed and adapt as needed through the request of community. We do misstep. We misstep often because we're a very small team and we're working on a global scale. But when we misstep, we understand that it's okay to say, I'm sorry, it was not the intention to cause any harm. And these are the steps that we're taking to make sure that we are approaching this ethically, that we are prioritizing needs of community, so that we are not continuing to perpetuate harm that has been placed on us as a result of these colonial mapping exercises and so on. And so humility plays an incredibly large role in the work that we do. And it's just like, I think as human beings, we're so scared to misstep. We need to always be right. We need to always be the best and so on. But what if we remove that? What if we take that away and instead approach it in such a way that, we know that we're going to make mistakes, but let's make it better together. And the other thing, too, is that collaborations with Indigenous community members and really making sure that we provide a platform for them to tell their stories. That's ultimately our goal.
Well, for me as a non-Indigenous person, what we can hope to do is to enter into these conversations with very much an open mind and see our roles as facilitators and potentially as enablers, and then also not lose sight of the fact that the technology should not get in the way. It should be peripheral, and we want to be able to use that as a way to find maybe a new path towards understanding one another and being a new path towards communication. And I think that it's an iterative process. I think we discover along the way as these relationships mature, we learn what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, and we learn through observing these unintended consequences of our actions. But I think that first and foremost, and we have to understand that that when we step into that space, we're bringing our own biases, our own perspective, our own worldview that may not be shared with others. And if it's to be a true collaboration, there needs to be a stepping back.
Dominique, and just to to piggyback on that, when you had Catherine and I over to the Qualcomm Institute and you were showing us some of the fascinating work you were doing, and I was starting to have these ideas, and certainly things that you've touched on between the animate and the inanimate, and some of the scanning thing, and how you've brought culture and museums and underwater caves to life. They did this underwater cave scanning. Please, can we touch
Yeah, we
on
have
that?
some of those on the slides right now. I'll advance them as you talk. perhaps.
I mean,
It's
some of the work they're doing is just mind-blowing.
Well, I mean, for us, we're very interested, sort of separately academically, interested in this period that's associated with the initial peopling, or with most archaeologists believe is this period of initial peopling into the Americas. And we want to be able to reconstruct what the landscape would have looked like for those first travelers through the American continent. And many of the animals that walked the earth during this late Pleistocene, end of the last glacial maximum, the onset of the Holocene, the extinct species of megafauna that were very much a part of the landscape for these very early Americans. And we can't access many of these sites, right? They're in deep water, they're far inside a cave, beautifully preserved. And so we have to digitally document these bones of ancient proboscideans, elephant-like species, like mammoths, for example, and saber-toothed cats and bears and giant ground sloths. And we have to analyze them topside in these types of environments where we work with the divers to take virtual dives into the Pleistocene to better understand the story of this early period in American history.
And finally, what's the Sun Cave?
Well, the Sun Cave here is an open room scale immersive or semi-immersive 3D environment using passive stereo displays, so much higher fidelity than you would get with projection or projection mapping. And it's in these environments, well, you think, okay, well, it's great. We're going to have a VR experience beyond a head-mounted display. Why would we want to do something like that? Well, when you have your colleagues together and you're all wearing glasses and you take that dive into the data at full scale, it becomes this kind of deliberative environment where you can have a conversation about what you're seeing. You can explore the data collaboratively, as one would actually in the field. And discoveries have been made in the data. So for the divers working in these late Pleistocene sites, there are things they didn't observe when they were in the field collecting information, right? They're managing their gas supply, they're thinking about their decompression obligation, they're having to deal with trim and buoyancy. But when they come back and we bring all these data to life, turn on the lights inside of some of these places, they see things that they didn't see. And so we are discovering new archaeological materials, new paleontological materials inside these environments.
Fascinating. So researchers inside of the Sun Cave who are having the best of both, because you're communal, you're talking, you're discussing, but then you're also immersed in this huge, immersive reality where you're discovering and sharing. So it's kind of like the next iteration or the evolution of some of the things that most of us are talking about.
Yeah, I mean, we don't see these types of experiences as entertainment per se. I mean, we want to, again, spur analytical reasoning. We want to be able to start a conversation. And it's interesting, when you view data, as a scientist or you want to understand data as a stakeholder, when you see things, not on your laptop screen, but at full scale and in stereo, the gears in your brain turn a little bit differently. So you notice things you wouldn't otherwise notice. You make certain spatial or temporal contextual relationships or connections between phenomena, and it's very powerful.
Wonderful. Catherine?
Yeah, so my experience looking at the Sun Cave and certainly the wall was really transformative, because you do get a sense that you're looking at things at various scales if you're wearing, for example, a headset or something like this. But, the physical presence, even though they're 2D screens, but the physical presence of being in the proximity of something that is, right before you, and really in 3D. I mean, you put on these sort of, they're not stereoscopic, but they're just like a 3D glasses. You can see the texture of the wall. You can see the dimension of it, because they are using the photogrammetry processes and LiDAR processes to capture the dimensions of these objects. You're also able to, write the code that would enable you to lift a bone right out of the cave wall. That, to me, was the most transformative, because then you're able to sort of go to these places where really very, very few people will ever have the chance to go. And when they were in that environment actually it was dark. You couldn't see anything. You were just relying on a cave light, and you could snap some photos, as you do with photogrammetry. But then you bring it back and you put it in the sun cave, and it really is as if it had brilliant sunlight the entire time, and you had access to every single pore of the rock and the great. So that kind of information is really crucial to begin to understand what we're looking at in some of these places. So that to me is very transformative, this technology.
Catherine, you design beautiful things. Let's talk about design. Let's talk about beauty for a minute. Beautiful things can evoke emotions and inspire creativity and inspire motivation. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen the work that you've done. We've made people cry. Some of the work that we've done and that you've done have inspired emotion, evoked emotions in people. Historical examples of this would be like churches, huge churches, temples, these things that we build as humans to evoke emotions, to transform us to new places. This idea that building beautiful things and big things can transform us and help us bring out our ideals and live up to a higher standard. These things, you think of Cinderella's castle, I think Disney built it so that he could inspire his workers to look at Cinderella's castle, when they were building Disneyland. And he said, that's what Disneyland is about. Okay, so these icons, these monuments, these things that we build, how does that intersect now with design technology? Parallels with technology, building beautiful things with technology to inspire us to live and be and feel more.
Certainly. I mean, there are some really interesting, studies, about why beauty works. Like, why do we crave beautiful things? What is it about something that is beautiful? And certainly, there's that Keats poem, "Beauty is truth, and truth is beauty, and that's all you need to know," which is really wonderful. I mean, that phrase, I think echoes again and again, in different times and places in my life, and certainly many creators. And I think we all sort of crave an understanding of our realities, and that's what beauty does. It tells us who we are. And one of the things that is really interesting about your work too is it's not just caves. You're capturing cultural heritage sites, and really these are lifetimes and lifetimes of work of master artisans collaborating all together to create, over centuries in some cases with the cathedrals, the most incredible monuments to, to really celebrating the community of being together for a religion or for a cause or something like this. And so they, I guess like one, just to sort of, oversimplify, why did they make the churches beautiful? They wanted to create the community. They wanted people to come. They wanted to, sort of impress upon, the people of the time that this was the latest, this is the state of the art. This is what we're able to do with architecture, with engineering, with art. You'll learn from us. We're aiming for something higher. You should come. It will uplift you, spiritually, aesthetically, in every sense possible. It will awaken your senses to a higher calling. And so what's really interesting is that, certainly with, and we'll get to that in a moment, over the centuries, really, we have seen an evolution of what it means to create our realities. What I was really struck by, and I'll just tell you what's on the screen right now, is, of course, in the Middle Ages, you had these beautiful icons, and it was, I think, it must have been a very strong semblance of reality, and like an aha moment. It's like, oh, we've got skin tones. We can do skin tones now. That's so real, and like we can capture eyes and we can capture expressions, which is really very exciting. And what I think is really lovely too is, of course, these paintings existed in homes and in cathedrals, in places of worship, but they also existed for the traveler. So you have this, sort of traveling locket. And it is, a saint that was, perhaps of special relevance to the wearer. And we see some of that today, right? I mean, you want to take the beautiful things with you. We have our Instagram, we have our accounts, so this is what defines us. These are our stories. And not only do we crave the beautiful, but we want them with us at all times.
Yeah, so let's tie that into the here and the now and the future, right? About designing and creating the next reality, and just this nonstop evolutionary cycle. About what can we do with what we have and how can we make it better, and then new technologies come around. I mean, Dominique and I were talking about this last night, about how technology isn't just the code, it's also, a fork was technology. These things that make our lives easier and better and faster. Technology has existed since the beginning of mankind. Anything that improves your life or makes things easier to do is a new form of technology, going all the way back to, the cave days, said crudely. So what kind of future do you guys imagine? I mean, all three of you are future thinking, futurists, looking forward. How can we drive our civilization forward using the best technologies? And I love asking this on the panels that I moderate. Where do you see the next 100 years? Where are we going as humanity? How is technology going to serve us? Because technology is meant to serve us. We're not meant to serve technology. So where do you guys see the future going on? Each of you, any of you.
I mean, it's a tough question. I think one thing to reflect upon is this notion that perhaps technology and traditional or indigenous ways of doing some things are somehow it's antithetical, and of course it's not. As you mentioned, people have been adopting better ways of doing things since the beginning of time. And there are technological innovations that may, to many of us, seem quote unquote quite primitive or non-advanced, but yet are perfectly conceived and perfectly executed. If you look at something as simple as the toggling harpoon for peoples of the Arctic, from Alaska through Nunavut, they're using a device that has never been improved upon. It's still the best way to hunt. So there's no technology that can improve it, right? So, and I love that example. And so, we can advance technologies in different ways. And again, it's sort of separate from that, I don't see there being any sort of struggle between bringing XR into the kinds of conversations you're having with tribal communities. To me, it fits together very nicely.
It does, and the work we're doing, building worlds with communities, with immersive technologies, we're able to tell stories in our way that we've always told, but now we can visualize them in new ways. And so there's been kind of this seamless transition between indigenous storytelling and new technologies. And people, typically think that indigenous cultures and technologies, can sometimes have clashes, but in fact, now that we're able to tell stories in these new and immersive ways, it's been a nice transition between them. And it's interesting because we're extracting information, sustainable things that are so relevant in the year 2022. When I don't want to get into it. So anyways, so now we're learning so many important lessons about sustainability and the importance of female leadership and all these things where, these indigenous ancient wisdom systems that people at once thought were crude and savage are now turning out to actually be, where we're all headed as a society. It's like, okay, wait, maybe they had a good system to begin with. Let's start reimagining how they did things, and I think that's kind of what we're getting to here a little bit. So, Catherine?
Yeah, no, certainly. And I think the intersection of technology and design is really interesting, and it evolves every decade. I mean, so we have, currently we're working with indigenous stakeholders also. And just if you think about every generation of art having a layer of meaning, you have what you see in front of you, and then there's the reason why they did it. What's so interesting about the here and now is that when you talk about, the types of missions that I think we're all, invested in, is really just how do we get indigenous knowledge systems into scientific practice, or what's typically known as scientific practice, or the academic tradition, or GIS information, how can those knowledge systems merge? And so with technology and the types of technologies that we're promoting, we hope to be able to do that, because we certainly know that not everyone, as you mentioned, not everyone is going to, want to sit in front of a computer and code. But there are many ways as technology evolves. I mean, there are devices, we've sent 360-degree cameras out into the world to people in reservations, and they've been able to record their environment and, send the cameras back to us. And so, certainly beginning to, reinvent, in a way, the way narrative, oral tradition stories are told and shared. And, by placing them in geolocation, perhaps that reaches a wide cross-section of people, and it has some intersection and meaning in their lives.
Christine, I'd like to hear your perspective.
So I'm going to pull it back a little bit. So I'm someone, and I make the joke, my husband teases me often that I work in tech, yet I can barely use my phone. But When we're using, all of these incredible technological advances and, this beautiful design that exists, we have to make sure that we're taking a step back. And that what we're doing is when we're looking and when we're hearing these stories that are shared with us on incredible platforms and made by creators who are making these stories accessible to us, some stories that have been nearly lost or stories that are being reclaimed, we need to make sure that we're taking those stories that are in, the metaverse or whatever we're going to call it, in these immersive realities, but that when we put down our phones, when we put down our devices, when we step away from technology, that we have a much deeper and a much broader understanding when we're actually going back to land. Because ultimately, we need to still exist in this physical world as opposed to in a digital space. The digital space is helpful for us to understand stories and so on, but how are those digital technologies changing your understanding of the world? How are they going to change your day-to-day life to make sure that you are more conscious of the land that you're on, of the way that you act when you're on land, of the responsibilities that you hold to those territories, to the indigenous people who still remain on those territories? In what ways can we use this technology that is, bringing so much beauty to our lives to shift the world that we're in now, particularly to make sure that future generations are going to be able to share those spaces that we're in now?
That's an excellent point, Christine, because really it's those physical relationships, those physical places that sustain us and our families and our communities. So again, we don't want to escape. We want to be able to engage, and that's a very different way of thinking about entering into a different kind of reality.
So what am I looking at on the screen there? Christine, I believe this is your slide. Can you tell us a little bit about what is going on there?
So this is a screenshot from the Native Land website. So this is our map, and I make the joke that oftentimes we will shift the perspectives of the way that we see land. So here I've basically flipped upside down North America. Because, North America, we tend to think that we're kind of the center of the world, right? So in what ways can we sort of tip that off the balance? In what ways can we sort of shift our understandings and shift our perspectives and just really train ourselves to look at land differently and understand land a little bit differently? And so here you can see the overlapping colorful territories of indigenous territories are just absolutely across North America. And you'll notice, too, that oftentimes the territories do extend out into waterways and so on, because we understand that those are still lands, those are still places that we are tasked to steward and to care for.
Christine, so I'm part Irish and part Native American. My Irish family might look at that and not really care. Can you help me make the transition between, the fact that we're all native from somewhere? Are you doing this indigenous mapping in other countries or other places? Like, can we get to the heart of where we are all from? Not all of us are from North America. We all trace our roots back to somewhere, someplace. How are you rectifying visitors or, people who have settled here now, and we all call this place home, and we all have to work together moving forward in the future? But if I want to trace my Irish ancestry, how could Native Lands help me with that?
So you'll notice that there are places on the map that aren't necessarily colorful yet. And that's not because there are not indigenous folks there. It's not because there's no indigenous territories there, but rather we just haven't gotten to that point. And so you'll notice that South and Central America is starting to become more and more colorful. If you look at this in another couple of weeks, it's going to be a lot more colorful because we have regional experts who we have hired to map their own communities, to be the ones to tell us what the content is, what the stories are, who the people are, what the languages are, and so on, what the extent of the boundaries are. And so Native Land, though we started in North America, particularly in Vancouver, British Columbia, we're now on a much more global scale. And so you'll see, too, Africa is just starting to become a little bit more colorful, and same thing with regional experts. So ultimately, being able to see that there are indigenous people everywhere in the world, and being able to connect with place, seeing this map, and it's using that whole idea of counter mapping to upset those colonial boundaries to instead prioritize indigenous understandings of land. When you visit the website, when you click on a territory, it will actually bring you up to what we call a nation page. That nation page will then tell you basically the sources that we use to come up with the general shape. And it will link out to different nation and tribal websites and so on. And it will as well show a change log of the amount of times that we have edited the space. And so that really shows that we're interacting with community. We are relying on community to help to show the map and have the most accurate representation of indigenous territories.
Can I ask you a question, Christine? I'm curious, to what extent has this knowledge now out in the open and shared been used to assert sovereignty, maybe used in the realm of policy as a way that empowers people and allows them to demonstrate that they that these lands were theirs, and that potentially there should be policy in place to secure that sovereignty?
So when you visit the website, you will see that there's a disclaimer that pops up saying that we do not represent legal boundaries because they are not exact boundaries. That's not necessarily the world that we want to live in, only because you have these legal claims to territory which can then be contested and so on and create these major rifts and things. So we don't do that, but what we do instead is make sure that people are included on the map so that everyone who's using the map knows that those people either have been here or are still here. So we will have, so I always think of Bugungu community in Africa who reached out to us saying, because we have essentially been erased from colonial maps and so on, can you help us to make sure that people know that we are still here? And that's the sort of work that we do. We work directly with community to make sure the community is accurately represented. And so though it's not maybe legal, it just shows that people are still here, because that's kind of the point that we're at, is reasserting that presence, reasserting the knowledge and so on in the places that we've always been. So we're in essence helping to rewrite those histories and those counter histories and so on. But this is a visual representation of those counter histories that should have been told all along.
Catherine?
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Actually, how many developers are here in the house? Like, who here works in development or like creates? Well, it's okay.
One. Two.
Yes, so don't be shy. I know you're out there. It's all right. So no, what's the thing that's most fascinating to me? Well, there are many fascinating things, but one of the most fascinating things is that this map is, it's not a one-off. It's built on Mapbox, which is the same programmable engine that drives your DoorDash and your Uber, and you can track your poor little driver as he's making his way to you. Certainly, these types of maps with their data layers and their, programmable interfaces are extremely important to advancing knowledge. And the founder of the company, Victor Temprano, if I may speak with him, so he has been, extremely forward-thinking. So he is non-indigenous, but he developed this application, and he understood right away that it really needed to be in the hands of indigenous stakeholders. And so, then Native Lands as a company was formed. And that is really, the kind of model that we're approaching as well. Because if you are going to tell indigenous stories, you need to have really the buy-in and the narrative authority of the original stakeholders. And what's really interesting, too, about the technology is that it's able to be, they've made it open source, and, like many, APIs on Mapbox are that, other people have used. And so we're able to use that, really for different purposes in our own application. So we're looking at an artificial intelligence generated, basically animation from a collection of landscapes that are tied referentially to a particular geolocation. And so what that means is that if you have a programmable interface, if you have these data sets, if you have this creative vision, if you have another ingredient in our case, narratives from a tribal elder who understands the evolution of a place in both geography and also in storytelling and certainly perhaps some spiritual aspects of the land that they're on, we're able to now merge some of those concepts together into an experience that's going to help transform understanding of what the evolution of a geographical place perhaps was, both spiritually, both geographically, historically. And so that's what's really exciting about this beginning to create technologies that really can can merge different knowledge systems.
So going back to my Irish side, why should I care? How does this impact me as in my Irish side of the family who immigrated to America, and now I'm making my way through America as an Irish descendant, and I know I'm from Ireland, but like, how does this relate to all of us, and why should we care?
What's really interesting is that, of course, our platform can speak to all people. So we are not only able to tell indigenous stories, we're able to tell the stories of the immigrants to America, what their neighborhoods were like, what your grandparents may have experienced, stepping off the boat perhaps, or what they experienced living in New York City, or their first entry into school, and what it was like when really kind of the social acceptance of different populations was at any given time. So with the historical overlays, we are able to tell all kinds of stories. We're able to put these narrative tools, these storytelling tools, in the hands of non-expert creators. And that's really what we hope to achieve. Additionally, like even if the project were, or this was a project that was only about indigenous stories around you, it is actually quite interesting. I mean, you may not be interested at first. It may take some time before you are. It may take, like you could tell, your kids, just pick up your socks. But until, they actually, want to actually do it themselves, that they're not going to have any investment in doing it. What is so interesting about creating another immersive reality layer, whatever that takes, whatever form that takes, is that it's always there. So you might at some point be curious, and whenever it is that you sort of jump on that wagon and begin your sort of path to inquiry, then you're off and running. Then it's going to be sitting there waiting for you.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to note that we all have our perspectives and understandings that bring us to place, right? And it may be, as Catherine said, we might not be fully immersed and want to necessarily dive in deep and so on. Maybe we don't want to know about this. But when you do, and this is my perspective as someone who is of mixed heritage, indigenous, non-indigenous, is that I can understand perhaps the history that brought me to physically being here, to being in this place. I can look at what that deeper history is, what the longer history is, what it meant for my Irish family, my Polish family, and so on, to come to unceded Algonquin territory, to settle and have farms that still exist in my family. And basically, it's helping me to reconcile what those two, what are seemingly opposing parts of my histories would be. But instead, I tend to often make the joke that obviously my indigenous family and my non-indigenous family got along fairly well because I'm the result of that. And so for me, it's a way that we can dig in a little bit deeper and understand the histories that have brought us to present day. But then why is that relevant? So if we can take where we are present day, look to the future. What do we need to know? What are those relationships that we need to have? What can we learn from past to change future and make sure that this is something that we can basically carry on together?
Fascinating. I heard you both say the same thing in two different ways. If you don't care about indigenous stories, whether you care about indigenous stories, Native American stories or not, there's no shortage of culture that we can't do this with. Black culture, Mexican culture, Irish culture. I think I'm hearing you that culture is universal. We're all from somewhere. We all are from some country, and we can capture the stories of the communities of the people who lived there in the past, right? Hundreds, thousands of years ago, or people who live there in the current, right? So we're spanning the time-space continuum using technology to highlight the best of the cultures that we're all from. So that's how it ties together. Those of you who didn't leave, thank you for staying here. Because the way that this all ties together is that whether it touches you or whether you understand it now, at some point you will, that as we travel down the road, we've chosen to start at the beginning of American history with our work dedicated to the Native American, because if we're going to move forward together, if we want to heal as a country, if we all want to walk forward into the future in a good way, then let's go back to the beginning and start making things right from the beginning and walk forward. And eventually, when we're all telling our stories in this way, when we're all reimagining our futures, our cultures, our civilizations from the lands where we're from and the lands that we now share, when that happens, it's going to be a more beautiful place. That's the future that we're building at Our Worlds. Our Worlds is doing this work. You're doing this work, Dominique. you're doing this work. We're doing this from a good place so that we can do this communal approach to world building, not this top-down model that we read about every day. So I believe that the work we're doing is more substantial, it's more significant, it touches us, it goes back to our roots of humanity. What can Native Americans teach us in the year 2022? More than you might think. There's a lot of questions that some ancient civilizations already had figured out, and now we're coming in our way full circle to find out that maybe we weren't the savages that everybody thought we were originally, because we're touching people, we're impacting people, we're tapping in to that deep communal sense that we all crave and that we don't necessarily always get on Instagram. So what does that mean? That means that you came to a great panel because we have a message that's resonating with people more than other messages, because, hey, we're all a community. We're all trying to build a better future. You know, the most reasonable people who I know want to listen and want to move forward together. That's what we're doing. We've got about 5 minutes left.
Should we open it up to questions?
Just open it up
Yeah.
to just everything. It's anarchy at this point.
So I'm just going to refresh the slides, but please.
Hi.
Hey there. You've shown a lot about the visual layer of XR. Have you got any projections about the other layers, like sound, taste, scent, that might enhance an XR experience? So, for example, if you wanted to share a smoking ceremony of First Nations or a sacrifice in Scandinavia, like, have you got any insight on hardware and how that's going to
I've got a wonderful answer for that. Can I just jump in?
Yeah.
Go.
So if you have time, please come visit us at the XR Pavilion on the 3rd floor of the Fairmont Austin. So the XR exhibition and competition are running through today, 11 to 6 p.m. today. And we have an activation that's called Choctaw Code Talkers. And I'll show you a visual from that in a moment. Essentially, we have created a recreation of World War I tents. You walk into the tent, you hear that, we have World War I soldier reenactors dressed in period uniform. You clomp onto the wood, you smell the fabric. There's a little smell of diesel and campfire and smoke. And we certainly think that those kinds of experiences, they're fun. And they also really awaken your senses to, history. As we all know, our olfactory senses are very much tied to, very closely, located in our brains to our memory. And so that's why when you smell something, oftentimes it'll evoke very strong memories in the past.
Did you say hardware?
Yeah, I'm just interested. Obviously, haptics is another area.
Certainly.
I'm really interested in that, full scale kind of immersive experience.
Yeah, no, so Haptic Touch, we do employ that in our app as well, certainly to get people calibrated to, use our app. We have all of our immersive experiences available to the Oculus as well, of course, but then also on a handheld device. And then to get that oriented, you provide feedback. It buzzes if you've tipped too much this way. It buzzes a different way if you've done it correctly. So those kinds of things, I think, are very powerful.
Wonderful.
Here's a scene from, the visual that you would see if you come to see the experience. I mean, one of the ways that we want to present historical characters, we didn't get too much time to touch upon that, but, speaking of realities, how do you present historical characters respectfully? And so we're pioneering different ways to represent historical characters in your space. So holograms, then what do the holograms look like? You have a lot of design decisions there. It's like, do you create, them as dots? Do you use lines? Is it energy? Is it a color? Is it just sort of like a pulsing shape? So all of those kinds of things can evoke presence without actually sort of purporting to know exactly what someone looked like or the details of their physical appearance or their facial features, et cetera. So we think that kind of cuts across cultural boundaries as far as what is respectful.
I have to,
way to.
we're running out of time,
Okay.
so just got.
Oh, no, I just had a closing observation, is that I think what's very interesting about the metaverse concept with respect to indigenous knowledge is that it really does nicely blend or resonate well with indigenous or tribal concepts of physical and metaphysical, and in the spiritual and the mundane, or a reality and surreality. They're not really these dichotomies or visualized in such a binary way as they might be in Western civilization. So this kind of merging or blending between different realities is something that's been around since the beginning of time.
Wonderful. Okay, and any closing remarks that are on your mind?
I think that we probably could have talked for about another hour.
Went fast.
So the only thing that I just want to say to everyone who's here and who's already left is Chimigwich, thank you so much for being here, for listening, and certainly if anyone wants to connect with Native Land Digital, please visit, get in touch with us. If there's anything that we need to change, if there's anything we need to add, one thing I do want to mention is that we're going to be starting community pages. So it's actually going to be community-led process where people are able to contribute their own content on our platform. So that's what's coming up next for us.
Okay, any final words, plugs? Anything?
Certainly check out our app in addition to coming over to our XR Pavilion 11 to 6 p.m. today, ourworlds.io/beta. If you come to our booth, you'll also get a card and a QR code that you can use to download the app. But certainly we're in open beta. We hope to launch in a few weeks, and we're beginning to create place-based stories all over the world. So I encourage you to check it out and try it.
Okay, and that being said, why don't we do a round of applause for our panel?